Nzinga of Ndongo, the queen who refused to kneel for anyone. In 1622, a woman walked into a negotiating room in Luanda to face the governor of the Portuguese Empire in Central Africa. She had crossed dangerous territory to get there. She was representing a kingdom under existential pressure. She was a woman in a world that had few precedents for women in her position. And the Portuguese, either through calculated insult or deliberate contempt, had not provided her with a chair. What she did next has been remembered for 400 years. What kind of woman walks into a room like that and walks out on equal terms? And what happened in the decades that followed when the negotiations eventually broke down and the only option left was war? Her name was Nzinga Mbande. She was born around 1583 in the Kingdom of Ndongo, in the territory that is now northern Angola. She would live to be 80 years old. She would rule two kingdoms. She would fight the Portuguese Empire for nearly 40 years. She would forge alliances with rival African states and with Dutch naval forces. She would personally lead armies into battle in her 60s. And she would die at 80 with a sword nearby, having never surrendered. Stay until the end. Because the full story of Nzinga of Ndongo is not simply a story about one remarkable woman. It is a story about what resistance actually looks like when the odds are catastrophic, and about what it costs to refuse to bend. So who was Nzinga before she became a queen? Born around 1583 into the royal family of Ndongo in Kabasa, the capital of the Kingdom of Ndongo in central West Africa, Nzinga grew up during a turbulent period. The Portuguese had arrived on Africa's west coast in the late 15th century, driven by trade and a thirst for territorial control. By the time Nzinga was a young woman, her homeland was already feeling the pressure of European encroachment, slave raids, and internal political instability. From a very young age, Nzinga underwent military training and became a skilled warrior. Being part of the royal family, she was often seen beside her father, observing how the king executed his duties. She attended war and legal councils and participated in spiritual rituals. She was not simply raised as a princess who might one day marry into power. She was raised as someone who was expected to understand power, how it was built, how it was defended, and how it could be lost. By the time Nzinga was born around 1583, Ndongo faced existential crisis. The Portuguese had established a permanent presence in Luanda in 1575, initially as a trading post but increasingly as a base for territorial expansion. Portuguese soldiers, armed with firearms and cannons, pressured Ndongo militarily. Portuguese-allied African groups conducted slave raids into Ndongo territories. The word Angola itself comes from the Ndongo title for their ruler, Angola. The kingdom the Portuguese were attempting to subjugate had given its name to the colony they were trying to build on top of it. Nzinga's brother Mbande became king. He was not equal to the pressure he faced. The Portuguese advances continued. The slave raids continued. The kingdom was losing ground in every sense: territorial, economic, political. By 1622, Mbande was desperate enough to try diplomacy, and he needed someone who could actually do it. He sent Nzinga. Nzinga was aware of her diplomatically awkward position. She spoke Portuguese. She understood the political dynamics of the negotiation in a way her brother did not. And she understood that arriving at a meeting with Governor João Correia de Souza was not simply about the terms of a treaty. It was about what was established in the room before a single word of negotiation was spoken. Her negotiations with the Portuguese began with a famous incident. The Portuguese, either through ignorance or in an attempt to insult her, provided her with only a mat to sit on at their meeting. The mat was not a neutral logistical oversight. In Bundu custom, sitting on a mat while another party sat on a chair established a visual hierarchy, one party above, one below. To accept the mat was to begin the negotiation already diminished, already in a posture of submission. It was a statement made before anyone had opened their mouth. In response, Nzinga ordered one of her servants to bend and serve as her chair, asserting her right to sit on the same level as the Portuguese. The image of that moment: the governor in his chair, Nzinga seated on the back of a kneeling attendant at the same height. The negotiation, beginning on equal terms, was documented by an Italian priest named Giovanni Antonio Cavazzi, who later memorialized it in an engraving that still exists. It is one of the most striking images in the history of African resistance to colonialism. And then she negotiated. She demanded that Portugal remove the forts built inside Ndongan territory, and was adamant that Ndongo would not pay tribute to Portugal, noting that only conquered peoples paid tribute and her people had not been defeated. She also expressed a desire for cooperation between the two kingdoms. When the Portuguese questioned her commitment to peace, Nzinga offered to be publicly baptized, which she was with great aplomb in Luanda. A peace treaty was agreed. She returned to Kabasa in triumph. The peace did not hold. It rarely does when one party is expanding an empire and the other party is in the way of it. The Portuguese continued their encroachments. Nzinga's brother died by his own hand, according to most accounts, in the face of rising Portuguese demands. And Nzinga, who had already proven herself the most capable political mind in the kingdom, took power. In 1626, Nzinga became Queen of the Mbundu when her brother committed suicide in the face of rising Portuguese demands for slave trade concessions. Nzinga, however, refused to allow them to control her nation. What followed was not a single decisive battle or a clean moment of victory. It was nearly 4 decades of sustained resistance, strategic, adaptive, and relentless. Queen Nzinga trained her army in the art of guerrilla warfare, conducting hit-and-run attacks on Portuguese settlements and supply lines, which severely disrupted their operations. She did not fight the Portuguese the way a conventional army fights a conventional army. She understood that Ndongo could not match Portuguese firepower in open battle. So she changed the terms of the fight. She used the terrain, she used speed, she used the forest. She made every Portuguese advance costly in ways that added up over years rather than being decided in a single engagement. During this time, Nzinga formed an alliance sealed through marriage with the Imbangala Warrior Society, building a new military power between 1631 and 16 of Matamba, which had a tradition of female rulers and did not offer strong resistance. She welcomed nobles from her homeland along with enslaved people who had escaped Ndongo, granting the displaced nobles land and titles and transforming Matamba into a strong resisting power capable of disrupting Portuguese rule. She had lost her original kingdom, so she built another one. Nzinga formed alliances with neighboring African states and even with the Dutch, who were enemies of the Portuguese. She reorganized her armies, blending traditional combat with newly acquired European tactics. She exploited European rivalry by forging an alliance with the Dutch, who had conquered Luanda in 1641. With their help, Nzinga defeated a Portuguese army in 1647, when the Dutch were in turn defeated by the Portuguese the following year and withdrew from Central Africa. Nzinga continued her struggle against the Portuguese. Now in her 60s, she still personally led troops in battle. In her 60s, personally leading troops. After 2 decades of sustained military resistance. After losing one kingdom and building another. After watching the Dutch, her most powerful ally, withdraw and leave her fighting alone again, she kept going. Her strategic acumen and unwavering determination were instrumental in her successful resistance against Portuguese colonization, culminating in the signing of a peace treaty in 1657 that restored Ndongo to her control. A peace treaty in 1657, 35 years after the negotiation with the chair. After decades of war, displacement, guerrilla campaigns, alliances forged and broken, a kingdom lost and a new one built, the Portuguese, who had spent decades trying to subjugate her, eventually agreed to terms. She had outlasted them, not perfectly, not without enormous cost, but she had outlasted them. Queen Nzinga Mbande died in 1663 at the age of 80. Her death marked the end of an era, but her legacy lived on. She had ruled for 37 years. She had resisted the Portuguese Empire during a period when virtually every neighboring state was being absorbed, dismantled, or subjugated. She had done it through a combination of military ingenuity, diplomatic sophistication, strategic alliances, and a refusal, consistent, absolute, lifelong, to accept the premise that she or her people were defeated. The governor who denied her a chair in 1622 was gone within a few years, replaced by the next Portuguese official in a long line of them. Nzinga was still fighting, still negotiating, still ruling 40 years later. She walked into that room in Luanda and sat at the same height as the man who had tried to make her kneel. She spent the rest of her life making the same argument, with words, with armies, with alliances, and with a stubbornness that proved impossible to extinguish. Drop a like if this story deserved to be told, subscribe for more, and leave a comment. What is the detail from Nzinga's story that you will remember longest?